The federal government just froze the entire hospice enrollment system. Not one program, not one region, the entire country. CMS issued a 6-month moratorium on new hospice and home health enrollments. DOJ and HHS-OIG are executing coordinated enforcement actions right now, and the target is a system accused of billing Medicare for patients who were never dying.
This is not a crackdown on a few bad actors. Federal investigators are treating hospice fraud as an organized extraction operation. Tonight, the DOJ makes arrests, CMS pulls the trigger on enrollment, and California intensifies its own investigation. The hospice industry just became a federal crime scene.
First, the arrests. The DOJ and HHS-OIG announced the takedown of 8 individuals connected to an alleged $50 million hospice fraud scheme. According to prosecutors, operators enrolled patients who were not terminally ill, healthy patients, billed to Medicare as receiving end-of-life care. That is the allegation, and it is now a federal criminal case.
$50 million, 8 defendants. And this is one case in one enforcement action. The West Coast Strike Force has been expanded specifically to handle the volume of hospice fraud referrals coming out of California. That expansion tells you something. When the government scales its enforcement infrastructure, it is not done making arrests.
Second headline: California is intensifying its own hospice fraud investigation. State investigators, working alongside HHS-OIG, the California AG, the Department of Healthcare Services, and DOJ, have identified widespread fraud indicators across hospice operators in Los Angeles County. The pattern: suspicious clustering of hospice licenses, fraudulent billing indicators, and possible identity theft connected to patient enrollment.
What makes this significant is the coordination. California AG, DHCS, HHS-OIG, DOJ, CMS. That is not a state audit. That is a multi-agency enforcement posture. When this many institutions move together, they are building something larger than individual prosecutions.
Third headline: CMS has issued an unprecedented 6-month nationwide moratorium on new hospice and home health enrollments. This is tied to a $1.4 billion federal funding freeze connected to expanding fraud investigations. CMS has the authority to freeze enrollment when fraud risk is elevated. They used it nationwide. That has not happened before at this scale.
Read that again. $1.4 billion frozen. New enrollments halted across the country. For legitimate hospice operators, the ones doing this right, that moratorium creates real operational pressure. For the ones under investigation, it cuts off the pipeline. That is the point.
Here is what federal investigators are actually describing: not isolated fraud, not a few operators cutting corners. The allegation from DOJ, HHS-OIG, and CMS is that portions of the hospice industry have been operating as a coordinated extraction system, targeting Medicare, targeting the dying, and in some cases, allegedly, targeting people who were never dying at all.
The mechanics matter here. Medicare pays a fixed daily rate for hospice care, roughly $190 to over $1,000 per day, depending on care level. If you enroll a patient who does not qualify, someone not terminally ill, someone whose identity was stolen, someone who never consented, you collect that rate every day with no legitimate service delivered. Multiply that across hundreds of patients, across dozens of operators, across years. That is how you get to $50 million in one case and a $1.4 billion enforcement response nationally.
The West Coast Strike Force expansion is the enforcement signal. Strike forces are stood up when the volume of cases exceeds the capacity of standard prosecution channels. The federal government has now formally acknowledged that hospice fraud in California, specifically Los Angeles County, requires dedicated infrastructure to prosecute. That is not a warning shot. That is an operational commitment.
And the CMS moratorium closes the front door, while enforcement works through the back. No new enrollments means no new revenue streams for operators under scrutiny. Combined with the funding freeze, this is a coordinated squeeze. The government is not just prosecuting what already happened, it is shutting down the mechanism that allowed it to keep happening.
The question federal investigators are now answering is, how deep does this go? Are these independent operators running parallel schemes, or is there organizational structure connecting them? That answer will determine whether this stays a fraud crackdown or becomes something larger. In our last episode, we introduced the first wave, the National Fraud Enforcement Division, the 30-day consolidation deadline, the pipeline of cases moving through DOJ and HHS-OIG simultaneously. We asked, does the machine expand or does it stall?
Chapter 2. It expanded. The hospice enforcement action is not a separate story from the first wave. It is the wave making landfall. What we are watching is the NFED infrastructure, the coordination between DOJ, HHS-OIG, CMS, state attorneys general, executing at scale for the first time. Hospice fraud is the test case, and the test is producing arrests, freezes, and multi-agency coordination simultaneously.
Federal enforcement and independent media investigations have both identified the same pattern: widespread abuse indicators within portions of the hospice system. The federal government's response confirms they have been watching this for some time. The moratorium, the strike force expansion, the coordinated state and federal posture. These are not reactive moves. This enforcement posture was built in advance.
Which brings us to the open question for Chapter 3. Los Angeles is the current epicenter, but the moratorium is nationwide. If the fraud indicators that drove enforcement in California exist in other markets, and federal investigators have suggested they do, then the West Coast is not the end of this story. It is the beginning.
The federal government has frozen hospice enrollment, made arrests, expanded enforcement infrastructure, and tied $1.4 billion to an active fraud investigation. That is the state of play tonight.
What we do not yet know is whether the organizational structure behind these schemes is isolated to California. Federal investigators are still building that picture. When they finish, the arrest count will not be 8. Stay sharp.